Port Gamble Bay is one of the priority locations for Olympia oyster restoration, according to Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Way back in 1850, there were dense Olympia oysters in parts of Port Gamble Bay. Throughout Puget Sound, there were at least 10,000 acres of these dense native oyster beds. We're down to less than 4% of dense populations today, and so we're trying to rebuild that habitat feature. The tribe was out doing some surveys recently, and they found some more Olympia oysters in this stretch. And the oysters that they found are sort of at the lower edge of this Pacific oyster bed that kind of is spread along this particular shoreline. So we're going to go and verify that they're there. Great. And also see how many there are. This is really nice, actually. I mean, this is a fair number, pretty easily found. And it's got these kinds of ridges on the underside. Some people liken it to a raccoon foot. Pacific oyster shell provides like an ideal settlement substrate for Olympia oysters, and that's what we use in our enhancement projects. Here in Port Gamble, there aren't enough Olympia oysters. We have to produce the seed first and put it out here and start to build up some density, like build up a breeding population, so that then we can expand the footprint by putting out shell.
Our native oyster is the Olympia oyster. This oyster actually has a pretty interesting life history strategy. Unlike most oysters, like the Pacific oyster and the eastern oyster, which broadcast spawn, the Olympia oyster broods its young inside its shell. The larvae develop inside the mantle cavity for about 10 to 12 days, up to 2 weeks, and after which the female releases relatively large larvae. The larvae then develop in the water column with the plankton for another 2 to 3 weeks before they settle and metamorphose into a juvenile oyster. In the ocean, they eat phytoplankton. In the lab, when we have them in a hatchery environment, we need to create as much phytoplankton as we can to keep these guys growing fast and healthy. So these guys are about 3 months old. And ideally, this would be the size that we would be outplanting them at, these larger ones especially. The seed that was produced in the Port Gamble hatchery was brought out here to Port Gamble Bay. It was small, so we needed to provide a little protection for it over the winter, so we put the seed in grow bags. We outplanted it. We'll break those grow bags open in the spring and spread the Olympia oysters here along this shore in the lower elevation. Thankfully, Olympia oysters are still cultivated by commercial growers, which means we still get to eat them.